Today we're going to talk about how we can build a web app using a single page application technology. So we're going to build a JavaScript application, then we're going to talk about typical challenges, and then I'll leave you with a bunch of links and resources. Cool. So this is what we're going to build. So I'm living in Switzerland. I'm originally German, but I live in Switzerland. So we're obviously going to build a web shop where you can buy cheese. And not only good cheese, so like Swiss cheese is one of the categories, but there's other categories as well, unfortunately. Yeah, cool. So fundamentally what we're going to build is a HTML scaffold that looks more or less like this. Right? We could use a framework, but why would we? So in this case, we just have a title here. We have a meta description, as you should have. And then we have some header component that gives you like this little header thing that has a menu bar. Then we have the main content that is all the cheeses or a specific cheese or like the card or whatever we have or whatever main content we have on that specific view in the single page app. And then we have the aside, which is like a navigation bar. Cool. So we could use a framework, as I said, but I'd rather not. For legal reasons, I can't use GIFs from the internet, so I make my own now. Yeah, so we're not going to use a framework, but fundamentally any of the tips or any of the things that I'm going to talk about today might be what you're going to encounter no matter what framework you're using. I will give some specific guidance for different frameworks in some part of the presentation, but all of this is generally applicable no matter if you're using a JavaScript framework or not. Earlier, someone asked me, like, how bad is JavaScript today? And my answer is like, what kind of question is that? JavaScript is a tool. How bad is a hammer? How bad is a knife? A knife is fantastic when I'm trying to cut open my bread, like when I want to have a slice of bread from my bread, but it's pretty terrible if it's right here, right? And like only the holder is like sticking out of my corpse at that point because I'm going to be like, ugh. So JavaScript is a tool. You can use it nicely or you can use it terribly. So let's build our application. So as we're not using a framework, I'm using web components fundamentally, a collection of techniques and technologies. I'm not using all of them in this application. I'm not using Shadow DOM and stuff, even though that would work fine. We are just limiting ourselves to a template. So what's going to happen is we have this template as a placeholder, and then whatever, depending on which URL we are on, we're going to load different templates, and this is like the main template for the different cards. So we have different cheeses here, each of them representing a card, where we have an image of the cheese, we have a headline for the cheese, we have a subtitle for the cheese, we have some summary text, and then we have a buy button. Cool. Now, to make this lively, I would say, what we're doing is we have a cheese API. Our cheese API returns an object that we need to parse from JSON. So if I'm on the Swiss category, I'm loading Swiss.json. If I'm on the French category, I load French.json. Then I look into the data that I get back. So this is like the first line here that like parses out the category that we are on. Then we load this category file. Then we need to make sure so like the text comes back. But we want to parse it as JSON so that we can actually load the data properly. And then we have this helper function here that creates the cheese cards. And as these cards, so the cards are basically the template filled in. So we get a list of cheeses, Swiss cheeses, French cheeses, Italian cheeses, whatever. And then we are filling in the cards using this function that we're going to look at in a moment. And as we have these cards, we then just add them to the list in the main content, and then we list them there. That's it. That's what all this code does. Now, the create cheese cards looks a little more involved, but it actually is relatively simple as well. We are grabbing the template that I saw earlier, or I showed earlier on. Then we are putting in the cheese title, we put in the cheese price, we put in the image that we have for this cheese. We have some summary text for each of these cheeses, and then the button, whenever we click the button, we call the buy function that lives somewhere else that actually puts it in the cart, and then maybe we have a cart somewhere where you can then proceed to payment and then pay and whatnot. I don't know. But fundamentally here we have a function that is called whenever I click the buy button, the cheese that I selected will be put in the cart or will be bought somehow. We don't care for this demonstration today. Now, how does this single page application work? Well, what we want is if I click on a link that, or if I go to a URL that is different from the current URL, I want a different template to be loaded, or a bunch of different templates to be loaded. The content needs to change. So I need to find out what category I'm on. Let's make this very simple. The only URLs that we need to support at this point are just the different categories like French, Swiss, and so on and so forth. One way of doing this, and the classical way of doing this, is we need some sort of event that the browser gives to actually call some code that we write, right? So there is an event happening in the browser, like I changed the URL or I clicked on a link that changes the URL. If I'm using hash URL, so if I go from hash Swiss to hash French, that causes what's called a hash change. And then I can listen to these hash change events, and when that happens, my code runs. So this code will be executed whenever the hash in the URL changes. And here what I'm doing is I'm slicing off the hash, so like we have hash Swiss, right? I don't want this hash, so I take that out, and then I have a category. And if I'm going to just the main page, I don't have a category, so I just default to the right kind of cheese. That didn't get as many laughs as I hoped for, but that's okay. So like I go to Swiss cheese by default, and then I show the cheeses for category, which loads this JSON file and then creates the templates and fills in the templates for the cheeses from that category. So with this, I have built my routing, right? So I can now load different cheese categories as I need it, and I can expand this. I can say, like, if this is not a category, but if it's like cheeses / something, then I want to load this specific cheese data, for instance, and stuff like that. So this is where my routing happens. Frameworks make this a little easier, but it's still fundamentally the same kind of code that runs there. Okay. Now we have our application together. I can click on different kinds of categories, and then as you can see, the categories change and the cheeses in the categories change. Different images, different text. Great. My application is now done. As a developer, I'm like, boss, I did it. All the tickets are closed. We have our single page application. All is good. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of startups stop until they do a Google search or a search in whatever search engine they prefer. This is a great. I love this, right? And this is a talk that I'm supposed to be giving tomorrow in 2 days in Germany. So like the .se is just like a little. It's a bonus that is given for free. So my homepage is indexed. I can see my homepage here, but none of my product pages, none of my categories are in. Not good. So what happened here? Sadness happened here. I made a bunch of mistakes, didn't I? Let's have a look. So my HTML looks like this, right? Everything gets loaded using the JavaScript. The JavaScript loads my scaffold, it loads the header, it loads the main content. And really what it does is it has a placeholder, and then it loads all the JavaScript that is needed. So this is actually not our application. Our application might have some HTML initially, which is great. But if you would be using any of the frameworks, you would end up with code that looks similar like that. And then a bunch of SEOs are just like freaking out, and they're like, what? No, oh my God, the crawler doesn't know what this is about. Whoa, this is terrible. The good news is that actually Googlebot does run JavaScript. Just a quick reminder on how we are indexing and rendering and crawling pages. So we have a bunch of URLs that we put in the queue, right? Once we pull one URL from the queue, the crawler makes an HTTP request to it and fetches the HTML. It gets either proper HTML that has content in it, then we look for links and linked URLs. If we find these linked URLs, we pass them back to the crawl queue. The next crawler picks them up, and it just keeps going. That's how we crawl through the web. However, in this case, we saw the HTML doesn't really contain much. We are putting it in a queue again. Usually this queue time is really, really short, but sometimes it is a little longer. And as the resources become available, we are rendering this page. What does rendering mean? Have you ever opened, who here has opened a website in a Chrome browser at some point in their life? Congratulations, you've been rendering websites. Good job. That's what happens. I mean, we're not literally opening a window, so it happens what's called headless. Headless just means there's no graphical interface for it, but on the server, a specific version of Chrome that we modified is fundamentally just opening the page, downloading all the JavaScript, and then running it. If your robots.txt does not allow us to get any of your JavaScript or make any of the API calls, we saw that it makes an API call, right? If your robots.txt says do not make an API call, then we're having a problem here. Because as this browser opens, it uses the same crawling infrastructure as the crawler does. So it does make HTTP requests, but it checks robots.txt first. So if in your robots.txt, that's like one of the mistakes people make. Luckily, not very many people make that mistake, but people make that mistake of saying like, Googlebot does not need to make these API calls. And I'm like, It's a client-side rendered single-page app. Yes, it does need to make these API calls. And if you're telling us robots.txt do not allow this, then we can't make that API call. So all the cheese JSONs, which is my API calls to get the data, will fail if I say robots disallow something JSON. Not good. Cool. So let's say that we didn't make that mistake. It gets all the resources. It does all these things. All of these requests call towards your crawl budget, by the way. So this is also one reason why server-side rendering might help you a little bit. If your client-side rendered app makes lots of API requests, these count towards your crawl budget. If you do that server-side and you just make like one HTTP response and then a few images and stuff, then you're saving on your crawl budget. Besides that, let's say like we rendered successfully, crawl budget wasn't a problem here. Now we can parse the HTML again. We see the links that you have. We pass the linked URLs on to the crawl queue, and then we crawl these pages and everything was good. And then we index it. Fantastic. But why was none of my subpages actually put in there? Let's have a look. So we can index this. This isn't the problem. What is the problem? One problem here is that, for instance, these links won't show up. Let's say like this buy thing here goes to a product detail page where you can then like decide if you actually want to buy it, how much you want to buy it, whatnot, maybe like variations of the specific cheese. It's a button. It might take you to a different URL, but this doesn't. That's just the button, which is not good. The rule of thumb is if it does something on the page that you're on, cool, that can be a button. If it does something that generates content that you want indexed, it should be a link. It should take a different URL in, and then actually we can use that URL to figure out that there's other content. Also, actually the link text here isn't great, just buy. It's not great either, so we probably want to start with looking into that. So first things first, we make that into a link. Duh. And now we actually change how we use this template or how we fill this template in. So instead of just having this empty link, oh, I made a mistake here. See, this is good. I'm just going to fix that typo real quick. So now this is a link. There we go. Ta-da. Done. So now we are selecting all the links, or the one link in our template, and we are changing the URL that it points to. Maybe our JSON has an actual product detail page URL that we can use here. And we also change the link text so that it says, in this case, by Tilsiter, which is a fantastic kind of cheese, as I learned. And then, again, we can do something single-page appy. So if we want JavaScript to kick in when we click on that link, that's cool. Totally acceptable, absolutely fine. So we have a click handler here still, but the Googlebot will find the link with the URL that we can put in the crawl queue. We'll be good. Sweet. Now let's look at these URLs. So as I said, we are using hash change events, as this is like the classical way of doing single-page applications. And I would have hoped that very, very, very few JavaScript developers are still doing it, because most frameworks have changed the defaults to use history API. However, it turns out that's just wishful thinking. So these hashes have a problem here. These fragment URLs are not meant to load different content. These fragments are to navigate to a specific part of the existing content. I have a very long page. I want to go to this very specific part. Crawlers don't care. We just index the entire page. So as far as we know, this is just navigating within this content. But because I'm a JavaScript developer and I don't care, I'm just like, nah, I'm just going to use it to like load different content, because why wouldn't I? This is the reason. You don't want to end up in this situation, do you? So that's bad. So we can't use hash URLs for this. What can we do then? Well, there's another standard that has been around for a long time and is really well supported in browsers. That's called History API. If we're using the History API, then we don't have this problem, because we can actually just use normal URLs. We change our code a little bit. In this case, what we're doing is whenever someone clicks on one of our links, we want to handle it and we want to update the history, the browser history. So in this case, as a single page application, if I click on a link, what happens? The page loads. right? The new page loads, the new URL gets loaded, the page refreshes. I want a single page application, I don't want that. Maybe I have really fancy CSS animations that like zoom and or like scroll or whatever the new page in, I don't care. But I don't want the page to reload, that's okay. I can just prevent that from happening by saying do not cause the default behavior for this event. Done. Next on, I get like something with slash, like let's say like slash Swiss or slash Jesus slash Swiss slash something. I want to get rid of the first slash so that I can like parse that a little more easy. That's the next line that I do here. Like I basically save the category, in this case like Swiss or French. I check if I have a category. If I go to slash, if I go to my homepage, I don't have a category. What do I display? The right kind of cheese. In this case, I just default to Swiss again. And then I do the same thing as I did before. I load the cheeses for this category. There's nothing strange or different here. I do one more extra step though. I do update the history, the browser history, because I want to be able to use my back and forward buttons to navigate between the different pages as if they would have been regular links. I can do that by saying, I have a new entry in the browser history here. I can add some additional information for myself. In this case, I save the category information. I can set a specific title. I just use the window title that I already have. And then I read from the href where this URL or what the URL for this browser state entry is. And then I have browser history that looks like it is an actual link and I clicked it and nothing JavaScripty happened here. That's it. That's History API. Now, as I said, I do no longer have the hash change event because the hash doesn't change, which is how it should be. What can I do instead? If I navigate using the forward or backwards buttons, I get a new event called the popState. That's when I move in the browser history that I just created, or in any browser history, really. What I do there is I look at the state. You know, remember that I had this like curly braces category? So I saved some state information optionally. If I didn't, that's okay. So if it's an actual browser history entry, then they don't do it. They don't know what I want in the state property, so I might not have it there. That's okay. If I do have it here, I use it just there. If I don't, then I have to parse it from the URL that I'm on, which might be a little more involved. Luckily for me, that's relatively simple. I get the category either from the path name or I get it from this category event. And then if I don't have a category, then I just set it to the right kind of cheese again. And then I do the same thing as I did before. I just load the information I want to show in this particular case for this moment in the browser history. I do the same thing as I did before with the hash change, just the code looks different. It's not a change in how my single page application works, it's just how it accomplishes the same thing. Cool. Now the question might be like, okay, cool, now this happened to me on my clients a few times. How can I figure this out? How can I be aware of this happening when I don't expect it to happen? The answer is Search Console. Search Console gives you like a bunch of information, and especially if you are moving from a non-single page application to a client-side rendered single page application, the Search Console will actually probably tell you if you're dropping these pages out of the index. So the coverage report is your helper. If you do these migrations, you get a warning when that kind of thing happens. Probably you want to test before it happens though, right? But let's quickly recap. Again, this is like a developer selling points for Search Console. One of the more important ones is I think the coverage report is your helper here, is your friend here to communicate to developers, look, whatever is happening, these pages that should be in the index are not in the index. Why is that? And then you can work with your developers to figure this one out. Again, that's how I sell it to developers. Like it shows you how you're doing site-wide. They like that. They also get help in debugging the problems, right? We have this lovely fix flow where you can share this specific report. So there's like the little share button here. You can hot link them into this specific problem. You can say like, why is this page a 404? This page shouldn't be a 404, should it? And then they're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And then they might like do some iterations and deploy a fix. And then they can click on the validate fix. And shortly after, they know if their fix is actually fixing it, because oftentimes it might not. It also tells you generally like how are we doing. Angular I/O had a problem. I love how transparent they are about this. Angular, even though it's a Google developed framework or Google supported framework, does not get any special tricks or treats. People are like, so we should switch to Angular, and I expected SEO to be perfect. And I'm like, why? It's developers like anyone else has, right? They can ask us things, and then we say like, there's the public channels. They don't get any special preferential treatment. And they had this issue that they deployed a new Angular version with making a little mistake, and then there was a ditch in performance, and then they're like, whoa, what happened here? And then they fixed it relatively quickly because they were monitoring it along the SEOs as well, which is kind of nice. You can use the live test or the URL inspection tool to figure out what's going on the page, especially if it's a new page and you wonder why is it not on Google yet. So this actually gives you a lot of information too. It sends you emails if something goes wrong. So that's a kind of pretty neat tool, and I highly recommend talking to developers about it because it turns out that developers don't really know about Search Console, and I think they should. It's a great tool for them as well. And one of the things that I see very, very often, and they're very inherent to the nature of single-page applications, especially client-side rendered single-page applications, is an issue with soft 404s. Why does that happen? Well, you get things like this because if the single-page application is deployed naively, which it often is, because it's so simple to do it wrong these days, you basically say to your server, whatever requests you get, send the index HTML, and the index HTML is going to load all the JavaScript, and then the JavaScript is going to deal with it, right? I showed you the code for routing. So routing is nothing else than looking at the URL and figuring out what content to display. So this is the point where the server then goes like, yep, this URL exists, here you go, have fun. And then the JavaScript goes like, no, what is this URL that you're asking me about? Like, I have no idea what you're talking here. And it looks like this. So developers are like, yep, error handling works, problem solved. Next ticket, please. And the problem here is that if you inspect this, and this is localhost. They could have caught this in localhost. Who sees the problem? I'll give you a hint. There is the problem. The JavaScript can't change how the server responded. The server is set up so that for every URL, it just goes like, yeah, it's cool, whatever, here you go, do your thing. And then JavaScript can't change that anymore. The status code is what the server says. The server says cool, so whatever JavaScript tries to do now, it's kind of stuck with the cool and then having to display actually not cool. Like Schrödinger's content or what? That's like not good. So how can you fix that? Well, one way of fixing it is actually you do not configure your server for all URLs to be happy and positive. You have one URL where you configure your server to give you a 404. That can be something simple like /notfound or /error or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. You have this one URL where the server is actually configured to give you an error, and then you use a redirect. Because what's happening here is, in our pipeline, we get the HTML, we render your page, this is executed, and then we're like, oh, actually, hold on. So this page is just a redirect to this other page. Cool. So we are trying to process the other page. We make a HTTP call using the crawler. The crawler goes like, well, I got a 404. And then we're like, okay, so this page says it's actually this page, and this page is a 404. Hence, the other page must be a 404. So this other page that we had a 200 code beforehand is now actually a 300 something, and that means that we are no longer indexing the original one, and we are not showing the soft error page ever, because we are getting this redirect. Another way is if you have a meta robots tag, you can dynamically create one, or you have one on the page that says, go ahead, index this page. You can switch that dynamically to no index. That's cool. That's fine. If your HTML is like, index me, and then the JavaScript is like, actually don't, then we're going to take that information. We're going to be like, all right, you don't want to be indexed. That's cool. We're not going to index you. However, you want to be careful with this. Having been a web developer myself, I made the mistake of going like, isn't it cleaner to just have no index in the HTML and then dynamically set it to index when we know that the content exists? Good thinking, bad idea. Because the thing is, our pipeline then goes, parses the HTML that has a no index in, and then we're like, okay, you don't want to be indexed. We don't have to run the JavaScript because we know that you already don't want to be indexed. Whoops. That was a very interesting conversation to have with our SEO at the time. I'm very glad that we noticed that in testing before we deployed this. But yeah, fun. Do not do it that way. Also, a lot of JavaScript developers who learned the JavaScript framework of choice learned it from reading their documentation and tutorials. And what I saw in every tutorial is they skip around a very simple piece of screen estate that you should care about and they should care about. They just don't know that they're sacrificing it unknowingly. Single-page application results often look like this. The same meta description, the same title on all pages. That's bad. Because you want it to look like this, right? You want it to be page-specific. Documentation usually skips it, and you have to take some extra steps. So it's highly recommended to talk to your developers about it if you see that all your titles are the same for the page. If you want better titles, then you can totally do that. In our case, we don't have a framework. That's cool. We just said like Jesus.title to something, and then maybe like we have a meta description that we can update the description to use whatever the cheese has. So we are getting these dynamic things. They will be picked up in rendering. It'll be fine. If you're using React, who here knows that their developers are using React? Okay, a few people just don't know because React is like the most popular framework, really. You can use an external tool. There's a tool called React Helmet. Your developers just have to include that, and then they can use like dynamic titles and descriptions in their components. It's not a problem. Angular has it built in. You just need to use it, which you only know if you actually read the documentation. Vue.js has an external one as well. It's called Vue-Meta. So if your developers are using any framework, they might need to figure out how they can do this in their framework. A few tips and tricks. Be very careful with persisting data. If you are relying on cookies or local storage or session storage or IndexedDB or anything, we delete them between crawls. So you have them available during a render phase. So like if you write something in at the beginning of the render and you use it at the end of the render of one single page, yes, that works. But across page loads, we don't do that. Make sure that you detect features if they are present and pre-prepared to handle errors. To give you an example, if you're using a service worker, which you should because it's fantastic and makes things faster. If you're using a service worker, we say we have this feature available, but when you try to actually register one, so the workflow is you ask if we can do it, and then you register one. We're going to reject this registration. We're not going to register your service worker. I get asked about server-side rendering. Server-side rendering is actually pretty fantastic. I'm done in a second. So I care about this website as a user. I want to look at doggos. So the most important metric here is time to first doggo. That's a lot better on the server side versus the client side. Same code is running here. So there's one version of it is using the framework server-side rendered. The other one is using it client-side rendered. It is a strategic investment you need to take. It is not trivial. It is not easy to do that necessarily, depending on your code base. If you're starting a new project, definitely recommend looking into server-side rendering as a starter rather than an afterthought, because it's easier to implement this from the beginning. Mobile-friendly test is something that I recommend all developers because they can use their local developer server and basically proxy that into the internet and then try things out. It tells them if the page is mobile-friendly, it gives them a screenshot, cool. It gives them the rendered HTML, which is really, really handy. It also gives them JavaScript errors. They can use this to debug the problem. It's not just like the old tool that gave you a screenshot, and then you're like, okay, now what? This actually gives you error messages that you can debug and work with. And this is a slide that I highly recommend taking a picture of or looking up in the video later on. These are additional resources that I would highly recommend checking out. I'll leave this up, but I say thank you already. Thanks a lot.